South Devon cows.
Rhubarb and fruit trees.
Best dog.
Frisian spring barley, the ewes and their lambs.
Living off the land, 100 years of farming in South Devon. Episode 7. Milking, mowing and maize. Livestock and crops on South Devon soil. South Devon cattle.
Before we came over, actually, Father had the silver medal for the highest individual milk yield from a South Devon cow, which in those days was a lot of milk. He had produced 1,700 gallons on this particular cow. And the herd average in those days was nearly 1,000 gallons, which now represents how many litres? 4.5 litres to the gallon. Which was really significant in those days. But obviously a lot of those cows then were milked 3 times a day by hand. There used to be the herdsman and then one other, a man that lived in the house, or a young man he was, that lived in the house. But he was an extraordinary person for getting milk. Even in those days he used to be paid a bonus for milk production. And obviously the South Devon cows were known for their butter fat and their beef and their milk yield. And after a while, obviously the milk side of it went downhill, if you like, and just concentrated on the beef side of it.
We used to keep cows and rear calves. So it was South Devon cows. So a cow would have a calf, and you go off and buy another calf to go with it. So that cow would rear 2 calves. And once it was big enough to be weaned off, you wean it off onto solid, and you would buy 2 more calves and put on that cow. And once those 2 calves were big enough to be weaned off, you go off and buy a single calf. So each cow used to rear 5 calves. You hand milk the cream, put it in big milk pans, put it in the dairy, let it stand and cool and the cream raised to the top, and then you scalded it on the top of the agar. And then when it was cool, you skim the cream off. Mother used to sell the cream and we lived on skim milk. Yeah, that was how it went. If we were lucky, we had some cream if nobody didn't want to buy it.
You see, I was involved in milking more, you see. I think the stork brought me in a milking bucket. So I've been milking as long as I can remember. Yes, we hand milk then, you see. And I'm going back to little cotton days. I mean, ours was different perhaps. But Mother and I used to do a lot of afternoon milking when the men were harvesting. Into little cotton, the cows we used to bring them in for shade. And the flies would terrify them in those days, because today they've got stuff that prevents the flies from teasing the cows. But in those days, it was very hot. The flies used to tease the cows. We used to bring them in midday. And then Mother and I and perhaps a man would come in and milk. And, we'd put the milk in it through a cooler and keep it cold. Because before 36, from Little Cotton, we used to supply dairies in Dartmouth. You'd take the milk in a churn and supply, we'd take it mornings and evenings. Father would take it. It wouldn't be big cunts, because I suppose we didn't have more than 18 cows, perhaps at the most, 20 perhaps. And then after 36, we bought a milk round. It was the top of Dartmouth, and we supplied a lot of the college masters and tutors from the college that lived in private houses in the town, and we supplied a lot of them with their milk, butter and eggs, until the war. When the war came, we used to go twice a day before the war, delivery with milk. That was after 36. And 39, we stopped the afternoon delivery, only went mornings, and then cream was stopped. You weren't allowed to make and sell cream. So that was the end of the cream in 39.
Well, I mean, my husband, this is Richard, who would now be nearly 70, was one of the first people to bring British Friesians, not Holstein Friesians, into Holborn, which was terribly modern and proactive with it, and was milking right in the middle of Holborn, which is now somebody's house. Before that, I think Grandpa Sherman had South Devon, didn't he? What was he milking there? South Devons and things like that, wasn't he? Yeah, mostly cattle, a little bit of corn.
Pigs, he had pigs, didn't he?
He had a few pigs.
Yeah.
He grew a bit of corn in fields you now can't get a combine small enough to get in those fields up those lanes. It doesn't exist a combine that small anymore.
And the other thing about these animals, of course, it would have been all South Devons many years ago. These are mainly either Simmental, most of them are Simmental Cross, Aberdeen Angus, or that's a Limousin primal. But the ones with the white faces are all Simmental Crosses. The continental breeds tend to grow a bit faster. Of course, when we had the Friesians come in instead of the again, they specialised. You had Friesians to produce milk, and you had the beef animals to produce beef, rather than being dual purpose. So that's when the continental breeds started coming in. Simmentals, Limousins, Blondes.
The British Friesians, and even more so the Holstein Friesian we never had, are much more specialist milking, really. Not so good for beef. The South Devons are a beef breed that do give milk, but it's specialisation, really. That's the difference, I think.
But when was the Friesians? That was sort of like that would have been the mid to late 60s.
I think Dad started. He left school in 61, I think.
Yeah.
And bought his first few cows there.
Yeah.
We've always milked cows on this farm. Initially, my father had South Devon cattle. Then during the mid-50s, he purchased Ayrshire cows and built up a herd of Ayrshires. And then in the mid-70s, then we put a Friesian bull on all the Ayrshires and had a Ayrshire Friesian cross. And over the years, I've used Friesian bulls continuously, so they're nearly pure Friesian now, all the stock on this farm.
I mean, a South Devon would produce milk more like the Channel Island cow would produce a lot more cream, less of it, better quality, shall we say, whereas the Friesians, which they first came in, the black and white ones, produced a lot more milk, but there wasn't the butterfat in it. And then over a period of time, they've gone from Friesians to Holsteins, which are nothing more, in my opinion, than walking hat racks. Because you never look at a Holstein and think, well, that's a nice animal. They always look thin. They don't look well covered, but they produce a lot of milk. Whereas the older animals, like South Devons, Herefords, what else is there? All those traditional British ones were dual purpose. They would produce milk and they would produce beef. But whereas a Holstein is absolute waste of time to produce beef because you can't get any meat on it. So they've specialised, and I don't know if that's all. When we were in Austria skiing one year, we actually stayed on a small place where the farmer nearby had Simmentals, and he was doing 8,000 litres with pure Simmentals. Well, people won't believe. So a dual purpose breed, which a Simmental is, that will produce just as good a beef as anything, will also produce milk as well. So it's possible.
Just, the whole dairy industry is the French. We'll take the French as an analogy. Then the French obviously have some very large farms, but they still have very small pockets of smaller farms. That's basically to do with inheritance laws, obviously. So it's enabled their way of farming to actually stay quite similar to what it was 50 years ago. But due to market forces, economic pressures, most British farms now have increased in size, and those willing to stay with it have stayed with it. It's not been deemed as a fashionable industry for the young people to go in, so probably in Dad's day at Bicton, I think you even went to Kingsbridge, didn't you? You didn't go as far as Bicton. when I attended Bicton in the early 90s, there would have been 40 or 50 agricultural students. Probably the same area would have been hundreds when Dad's age. And I think now they're down to bare numbers of agricultural students. So the amount of children willing to come home on a farm is a lot less than it used to be. But then on the flip side of that, there's a lot less farms for them to come home to. So where it'll go in the future, I honestly don't. I assume it'll go full circle one day. You look locally, a lot of people now are trying to buy farms themselves and have a small holding with chickens and that. So in real terms, that's a full circle, even though the money they generate has already been made in another industry. So I suppose things will move forward as they do, don't they?
I feel extremely sad today because you see there's no milking cows in sight. And up to 10 years ago, I mean, there was milking cows on Little Wad Street, there was milking cows on Little Wad Street, over the hedge, there was milking cows on both the Cotterberries. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 farms have completely gone out of milk completely. When you think of all the milk churns that used to be along this road, and you see there isn't a cow to be seen, is there?
Crops.
The cauliflower has actually been the kingpin to our family's success. There's a house here in Pro called Malcolm House, and it was run by a man called Captain Helby, and he was in charge of all the coast guards for the old southwest England. And he had been to France and seen cauliflower growing, and he brought some seed back from France in 1915 and planted them in down at Malcolm House where they were trying to do some market gardening. These cauliflower grew. He didn't know what to do with them. Grandpa used to go to Dartmouth, with his 1915, he had his T4 then. And so he said, I'll have them. So he took them into Dartmouth and they sold like hotcakes. So he then researched out where it came from. So then he got the fisherman in Dartmouth who went across to Roscoff to bring him back some seed. So the seed used to come back and we used to grow cauliflower. Cauliflower production at the maximum when we were all farming together, we used to grow 160 acres of cauliflower. It was when my brother John and brother William, we were all together. We used to grow 160 acres of cauliflower at, say, 8,000 to the acre, whatever that works out to. There's been a lot of work, but because we're on the most southerly point of Devon, and the land down at Pro Point, there are different levels. You have the high level at East Sprawl at the top, which is 540 feet. Then it drops down to the second raised seabed level, which is like 200 odd feet. And then the bottom level, right down the bottom at Langerstone and that, where the sea actually breaks into the fields when you have rough tides and rough weather and high tides. So we're sticking in the sea and we get a lot of salt spray, which protected them from frost, and we got away with it. That all went fine until the supermarkets came along, and that was the end of our cauliflower production. Because they treated us too rough, too hard, didn't want to pay enough money.
My grandfather's farm was 214 acres, but over the years my father and myself have increased it to 304. And it's quite a hilly farm. It's mainly pasture because of the hills, which obviously are dangerous to work on. And probably in this day and age, especially with the last year with all the rainfall we've had, not being under the plough, it's good to save the runoff and possible erosion if you should have them under the plough. We have these days about 250 ewes and about 30 beef cows, but when I was young it was a small herd of cows of about 15 which were hand milked. We still got one of the old churns in the yard that displays, reminds me of me hand milking the cows after school when I came home, and when I left school it was a case of, do we have a milking machine or do we carry on milking by hand? And my father decided it was the right decision to use the cows to rear the calves. And so we've got a beef herd, and which is built up to about 35 beef cows. And we've got, as I said, 250 ewes and their lambs. And we've got a few fields of corn which are at the top of the farm, which my neighbour does now that I'm getting older, and it helps my workload, and it increases his farm acreage for cereals.
We had our little garden patch. Father used to, do the gardening, and we'd have a little bit. You put in a few seeds. The vegetable garden was kept up. We always had rhubarb and fruit trees. You see, there was a man usually, and the man, perhaps of an afternoon, would go out in the garden, put in some potatoes, early potatoes, and then we had usually put in potatoes out in the field, to last us through the winter. And then there was turnips and kale. And yes, we used to grow spring cabbage at Little Cotton. Father had a little patch, and we used to grow spring cabbage and sell them on the milk round. That was quite nice, that was, because they'd love that, because you see they'd be fresh, and we'd take them Saturday mornings. You'd go up Friday evenings and pick them, and then put them in the car, pile them in best way you could, and sell them on the milk round in the morning.
It was growing 200 acres of spring barley, and that was it. Oh, that would be used for feed at the time. Mr. Holton, he then was my age, 67, 68, I'm coming 69, sadly. And when I took it on, we grew 160 acres of barley, 10 acres of potatoes, 10 to 15 acres of cauliflower, and 15 acres of sweets. And I made a big profit.
My father actually grew sugar beet for 3 or 4 years, and that would be in the early 60s, because I think it was 1963 that the railway at Kingsbridge was one of the railways axed by the famous Dr. Beeching. And I remember coming back from school down to the railway station. My father would have a truck to fill with sugar beet. It would be on the siding for about 48 hours, and my dad and his staff would have to be working in the fields regardless of the weather to get those sugar beet into Kingsbridge in about 6 or 7 trailer loads to fill this big truck. And I remember going down after school to help shovel by hand, that is, to shovel the beet from the trailers into this big truck.
Our sugar beet used to go from here up to Kidderminster to the factory. Obviously, when Kingsbridge Station was open, we used to take the sugar beet by our own lorry into Kingsbridge and unload them into the trucks. They then went to Kidderminster, and then when Kingsbridge Station was closed, we had to do it by transport, lorry transport. That was okay until they brought in transport regulations limited drivers' hours, and instead of 1 driver, they had to have 2 drivers. So in a very short time, that made that experience too expensive. So that's really when we stopped growing sugar beet. We had to grow those crops, cash crops as they called it during the war years. The farmers were given the opportunity to grow potatoes, sugar beet, that sort of thing, when my father decided to grow sugar beet.
We owe a great debt to my brother Roger, who drove away the lorry in about 1968-ish, and we went and we took the cauliflowers away to Oxford and to Fife's Group, and we owe a great debt to Fife's, the banana people, for buying and selling our produce. Before I came here with my brothers, I would be going to Bournemouth and Southampton twice a week, sometimes 3 times, but I got booked that time, delivering cauliflowers and vegetables.
And I can take you and show you where the mangoes that we're talking about that we used to hoe when we harvested them. When I say harvest, I mean go and pull them and cut the tops off. In fact, we used to twist the tops off because mangoes are like beetroot, and it's from the beet family. And we used to bring them down with initially with a shire horse and cart, but later with tractor and trailer. And we'd fill up. There was 3 what we call root houses on the farm. And this is one of them. And we'd be tipping them in here but there was a floor here, and there'd be just a hole here, and they'd be tipping them in and tipping them in. And I used to come back from school when it was nearly full, and I'd get in and throw them back to make sure that we could fill it really to the top.
You wouldn't plant the cauliflower on the north side because they get frosted, and you don't plant the cauliflower in the valley bottom because they get frosted. You plant them on the hill where the cold air slips off and slips out into the sea.
The whole coastal strip, they used to do an awful lot of cauliflower. We used to hear, but we used to grow them down on the land now. That's a lot of it's in environmental stewardship. I mean, we're growing long-term lays of grass fields, trying to get some of the wild flowers and doing that sort of thing. And that's because there wasn't the frost, being close to the sea. And you used to do a lot of cauliflower. So we used to, and again, a lot of that was, it wasn't all handwork, but quite a lot of it was. But now with the modern machinery, it just doesn't work. You need all the potatoes and cauliflower and all the cabbages and all that are grown in the fenland on big areas. And at one stage, 25% of the area was down to growing vegetables, crops, potatoes and all that sort of stuff. There's a few specialist people that grow potatoes. We got two brothers that grow a lot in our area here in the South Hams. And there's people in Cornwall that do the same. But a lot of the cauliflower and that started being imported from abroad because they weren't quite white enough here. They were slightest bit yellow. The supermarket would reject them. You can't afford to do that.
Okay, so when I was a kid, we had a massive, there was like half an acre patch of rhubarb we used to have. There was orchard with apples. So when I was a kid, for afters every day you had rice pudding and rhubarb, and then when it got to the autumn it was blackberries, so then you had rice pudding, blackberries and apple, and so it went on.
Some animals are special.
And that's not the hoofs of a Shire horse, that's a hoofs of a racehorse. It's our daughter has got a hobby, and we've got one or two horses that we've bred. We've been lucky enough to have Sarah to exercise them. So something we can just about to manage to have as a leisure pastime, because we can feed them from the farm.
The life of the little black ewe. It was about 1979. It was born in Lake Park at Higher Kernborough at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It was one of twins. It was a smaller one, and I took the little one and I put it in the Aga to warm up, and got the other one and put it in the old milking stable, and got a little bit of colostrum off it and fed it to the little black ewe and warmed it up. At that point I went to bed, and because I was going out all night with the lorry, I fed it again at 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock. The lorry came from Pro, and I fed it again, and we brought it back indoors, and Jane gave it a bottle. I drove the lorry through the night to Bournemouth, maybe Southampton, and came home in the morning about 12 o'clock, and whereupon we fed it again, and it was doing well. It went on and it ran on outside as they would do, with plenty of grass and whatnot. The following winter it went to Scobell overlooking Salcombe, and where my nephew Christopher, my older brother's son, he looked after it, and so it went on. That same 82-ish, 83, I came here, and by that time the sheep was then 2 years old or whatever. And my share of the sheep came in the September, after I got this farm fenced, and sure enough, out it popped the little black ewe. consequently, because it was black, people recognised it and we began to love it lots. And Jack in whatever in the bungalow down the road said, I'm closing my eyes as I'm saying this because I can remember better, said, here comes the ewe, 2 lambs, and sure enough it did. It lived on to be 10 years old or 12 years old, and I was rubbing it as it died, as it slipped away, the same as when it was born. In its brown eyes, you can never forget. Then Jolly, the Fathers for Justice, was helping me. Jolly Stainsby, you've seen him hanging on the top of the houses. He skinned it and I got it tanned and I've got it. And it's just the life that we do get attached to sheep, and more so because it's a black one. And ever since then, I've always had 1 or maybe 2 black sheep running on the farm. Hey Hope, with tears in my eyes.
Come on then.
Come on then.
Come on. How old are they? About 6 weeks?
6 weeks old, yeah.
So is this,
what are you
is this
doing?
mum?
Yes, it's mum. Yeah. And the father who's paralytic. They've got a fairly good pedigree of those.
Have you got homes for some of them already?
Yes, we have. Terry actually came this morning. He's going to have one. We got somebody having a look Monday night. Somebody else has already asked. So. I will go to farms. I wouldn't let them go anywhere else. Collies need to walk. To be fair, don't you? Little squeaky Joes, aren't they?
The first dog that we had, Father had a Rex from Stokely, which lost one of its legs, and I was riding on his lorry going to Horsley Clay Park, I think the field was called, and it ran under the lorry wheel and it twisted its leg off. I was about a little 3-4 year old boy. Mother would pack us off when they were digging in cauliflower plants at Horsley. Mr. Brooks, the vet from Mudbury, came out and collected it. A car at Horsley Beach was just on scene of. He drove down there with his car and took it and never got a bill for it. The dog, I was on a settee with it. I said to Mum, it's weed all over me. And Mother said with delight, yes, it's all right. So the name of Rex has gone through our family a few times since, and the Bruce and the whatnot. And the Benny boy I had at Canberra, which was he was a lovely dog, and he came with me all the way. He'd catch a rabbit a day, and when he rounded the sheep up, he'd go down through the middle of them, but he still got total control. That was that. And then since then I've had a Tess and a Tess, and you use a voice, a name which comes out of the front of the mouth, not a Scot out of the back of the mouth, so it makes your throat sore if you shout at a dog. 1 syllable. And now I've got my best dog, which is Bessie, which is a lovely little doggy and which does everything I want.
The Shire horses went in the mid-50s, but they didn't do a lot of work, but I did see them working. And my grandfather actually took me into the field across the way, and by the way, fields have got names, and that field was called Grattan. And that field, I remember going with my granddad with the Shire horse and the wagon to pick up the sheaves of corn, and it was probably in the late 40s, when I was probably 4 or 5 years old, sitting on the front of the wagon with him. And it wasn't until probably when I was 50-ish, I was talking to my dad about it, and he said, do you know, he said, your grandfather put that Shire horse in that wagon to take you to the field to get the sheaves of corn, to just show you what they used to do. And it was the only reason he took the wagon there that day, was to take you.
In Milking, Mowing and Maize, we heard from Harry Kurzweil, Jill Kurzweil, David Dark, Phil Dark, David Wall, Mark Wall, Richard Foss, John Sherrill, Jean Sherrill, Roger Tucker, John Tucker, Bill Salter and Marjorie Buckbit. Living Off the Land was produced by Lucinda Guy for Sound Art Radio in partnership with South Devon Area of Outstanding Natural Beauty and was supported by the Heritage Lottery Fund as part of All Our Stories.